In the twilight of a crisp autumn evening, Dr. Michael Harper stood before the imposing gates of Brookside Asylum, his breath forming ghostly wisps in the chill air. The edifice loomed before him, a Victorian monstrosity of weathered stone and tarnished copper, its spires piercing the gathering gloom like accusing fingers pointed at the heavens. Harper clutched his leather satchel tightly, its weight a comforting anchor in the face of the unknown that lay ahead. As he approached the main entrance, the gravel path crunching beneath his feet, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were upon him. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see a face peering from one of the countless windows that dotted the asylum's facade. But there was nothing save for the encroaching darkness and the rustling of dying leaves. The heavy oak doors creaked open before Harper could reach for the tarnished brass knocker. A stooped figure emerged from the shadows within, his face etched with deep lines that spoke of countless sleepless nights. "Dr. Harper, I presume?" The man's voice was a dry whisper like autumn leaves skittering across a tombstone. "I am Dr. Jeremiah Blackwood, Chief of Staff here at Brookside. We've been expecting you." Harper extended his hand, noting the chill of Blackwood's palm as they shook. "A pleasure to meet you, Dr. Blackwood. I'm eager to begin my work here." Blackwood's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. Come. Let me show you to your quarters. We can discuss your duties in the morning." As they traversed the winding corridors of Brookside, Harper couldn't help but notice the pervasive sense of decay that seemed to cling to every surface. The wallpaper, once vibrant, now hung in peeling sheets, revealing glimpses of mold-spotted plaster beneath. The air was thick with the mingled scents of antiseptic and something else, something older and far less pleasant. Their footsteps echoed hollowly in the near-empty halls, punctuated occasionally by distant muffled sounds that Harper couldn't quite identify. A scream? A laugh? The line between the two seemed disconcertingly blurred within these walls. "You'll find that Brookside is unique among institutions of its kind," Blackwood said, his voice barely audible above the creaking of the ancient floorboards. "We deal with cases that other hospitals deem untreatable." Harper nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral. "I've heard rumors of groundbreaking work being done here. That's part of what drew me to accept the position." Blackwood's laugh was a harsh, brittle sound. "Rumors, yes. We've had our share of those over the years. But I assure you, Dr. Harper, the reality of Brookside is far more interesting than any gossip you may have heard." They came to a stop before a heavy wooden door at the end of a particularly gloomy corridor. Blackwood produced an iron key from the depths of his coat pocket and turned it in the lock with a sound like breaking bones. "These will be your quarters," he said, pushing the door open to reveal a Spartan room furnished with little more than a narrow bed, a desk, and a single chair. "I suggest you get some rest. Your work begins at dawn." As Blackwood turned to leave, Harper called out, "Dr. Blackwood, I couldn't help but notice. Some of the wings we passed seem to be abandoned. Is the asylum not at full capacity?" Blackwood froze, his hand on the doorframe. When he spoke, his voice had taken on a strange, strained quality. "Brookside has evolved over the years, Dr. Harper. Some areas have fallen into disuse. I would advise you to concern yourself only with the active wards. Curiosity can be dangerous in a place like this." With that cryptic warning, Blackwood disappeared into the darkened hallway, leaving Harper alone with his thoughts and the oppressive silence of Brookside. Sleep did not come easily that night. Harper tossed and turned on the lumpy mattress, his dreams plagued by shadowy figures and distant, echoing screams. He awoke several times, drenched in cold sweat, convinced he had heard whispers just beyond the threshold of his room. But each time he opened his eyes, there was nothing but the impenetrable darkness and the faint scrabbling of rats in the walls. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the grimy window, Harper rose, feeling as though he hadn't slept at all. He splashed cold water on his face from the cracked porcelain basin in the corner, then donned his white coat and prepared to face his first day at Brookside. The morning passed in a blur of introductions and orientations. Harper met his fellow doctors, a collection of haggard, hollow-eyed men who seemed to regard him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The nurses were little better, moving through the halls like wraiths, their eyes downcast and their voices hushed. It was during a tour of the East Wing that Harper first noticed it, a corridor that seemed to lead nowhere, ending abruptly in a blank wall. As they passed, he could have sworn he felt a cold draft emanating from the dead end, carrying with it the faintest hint of a sound, a rhythmic thumping like a distant heartbeat. "Dr. Blackwood," Harper said, gesturing towards the anomaly. "What's down there?" Blackwood's face tightened, his eyes darting nervously to the end of the hall and back. "Nothing of importance," he said curtly. "An old wing that was sealed off years ago. Budget cuts, you understand. Now, if you'll follow me, I'll show you to the treatment rooms." But Harper couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Throughout the day, he found his gaze drawn back to that blank wall whenever they passed it, and each time the sensation of wrongness grew stronger. It was late in the afternoon when Harper had his first session with a patient, a gaunt, wild-eyed man named Thomas who claimed to be plagued by visions of the others. "They come at night," Thomas whispered, his fingers clawing at the arms of his chair, scratching at the walls, whispering, always whispering. "Can't you hear them, doctor? They're calling us to join them." Harper leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Who are they, Thomas? What do they want?" Thomas's eyes widened, darting frantically around the room as if searching for unseen listeners. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "The forgotten ones. The ones they tried to cure. But you can't cure them, doctor. You can only join them." A chill ran down Harper's spine. "Where are these forgotten ones, Thomas? Where do they come from?" Thomas leaned in close, his fetid breath hot on Harper's cheek. "The sealed wing," he hissed. "They never left. They're still there, waiting. Always waiting." Before Harper could press further, Thomas began to convulse, his body racked with violent spasms. Orderlies rushed in, restraining the thrashing patient as a nurse hurriedly administered a sedative. As Thomas was wheeled away, still muttering incoherently about the others, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than he had ever imagined. That night, as Harper lay in his bed, the events of the day swirling in his mind, he became acutely aware of a sound. Faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It was a thumping, rhythmic and insistent, like a heartbeat heard through a stethoscope. But this was no human heart. Its rhythm was too slow, too ponderous, as if it belonged to some vast, slumbering entity. Harper sat up, straining his ears. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the walls of Brookside, resonating through the very bones of the building. And underneath the thumping, barely perceptible, he could hear something else. Voices, countless voices whispering in a cacophony of anguish and madness. Unable to bear it any longer, Harper rose and crept to his door, easing it open with trembling hands. The corridor beyond was pitch black, the meager light from his room swallowed up by the oppressive gloom. But the sounds were clearer now, and Harper found himself drawn inexorably towards their source. His bare feet silent on the cold floor, Harper made his way through the labyrinthine halls of Brookside, guided only by the pulsing rhythm that seemed to grow stronger with each step. He passed locked doors behind which patients moaned and gibbered, their cries blending seamlessly with the whispers that filled the air. At last, he found himself standing before the blank wall at the end of the East Wing corridor. Up close, he could see that it wasn't truly blank. Faint lines were visible in the plaster, outlining what could only be a sealed doorway. The thumping was deafening now, reverberating through Harper's body, making his vision blur and his head swim. The whispers had risen to a fever pitch, a babble of voices begging, pleading, demanding to be heard. With shaking hands, Harper reached out and placed his palm against the wall. The plaster was ice cold beneath his touch, and he could feel a faint vibration, as if something on the other side was straining to break free. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on Harper's shoulder, yanking him away from the wall with surprising strength. He spun around to find himself face to face with Dr. Blackwood, the older man's eyes wild with a mixture of fear and rage. "What do you think you're doing?" Blackwood hissed, his fingers digging painfully into Harper's flesh. "I warned you, didn't I? Curiosity is dangerous here, Dr. Harper. Very dangerous indeed." Harper opened his mouth to respond, but before he could form the words, a deafening crack split the air. Both men turned to see a fissure snaking its way down the center of the sealed doorway, plaster crumbling away to reveal ancient, rotting wood beneath. The thumping reached a crescendo, and the whispers rose to a howl of triumph. As Harper watched in horror, the sealed door began to splinter and buckle, bowing outward as if something immensely powerful was pushing against it from the other side. Blackwood's face had gone ashen, his eyes wide with terror. "God help us," he whispered. "They're awake. The Forgotten Ones are awake." With a final, thunderous crash, the door exploded outward in a shower of splinters and decades-old dust. Harper caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness beyond, a writhing mass of shadows, punctuated by glowing, hate-filled eyes and reaching, grasping hands. As the first of the Forgotten Ones emerged from their long imprisonment, their unearthly shrieks echoing through the halls of Brookside, Harper realized with a sinking heart that he had unleashed something far beyond his comprehension, something that had been waiting, festering, growing stronger for all these years. The horrors of the Forgotten Ward had been unleashed upon the world, and Michael Harper knew that his nightmare was only just beginning. The chaos that erupted in the wake of the Forgotten Ward's opening was beyond anything Harper could have imagined. The corridors of Brookside Asylum became a maelstrom of shrieking patients, panicked staff, and the otherworldly howls of the Forgotten Ones. In the confusion, Harper found himself separated from Dr. Blackwood, swept along by the tide of fleeing bodies. As he stumbled through the darkened halls, the acrid stench of decay assaulting his nostrils, Harper caught glimpses of the horrors that had been unleashed. Shadowy figures lurched from doorways, their bodies twisted and malformed, as if the very fabric of reality had warped around them. Their eyes glowed with an unholy light, reflecting madness and an insatiable hunger that turned Harper's blood to ice. He ran, his heart pounding in his chest, the screams of the unfortunate souls caught by the Forgotten Ones echoing in his ears. With each corner he turned, the asylum seemed to shift and change, corridors stretching impossibly long or ending abruptly in blank walls that hadn't been there before. It was as if Brookside itself had come alive, becoming a monstrous maze designed to trap its inhabitants. After what felt like hours of frantic flight, Harper found himself in a small, cluttered office. He slammed the door shut behind him, fumbling with trembling hands to lock it. As he leaned against the wood, gasping for breath, he became aware of a presence in the room. "I told you, didn't I?" The voice was dry and bitter, filled with a resigned sort of amusement. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in Brookside. Harper spun around to find Dr. Blackwood seated behind an ancient oak desk, calmly leafing through a stack of yellowed papers. The older man looked up, his eyes gleaming in the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows. "Dr. Blackwood," Harper gasped. "What's happening? What were those things?" Blackwood sighed, setting the papers aside. "Those things, as you call them, were once patients here at Brookside. Some of the most difficult cases in the history of psychiatry. But that was before Dr. Crane got his hands on them." "Dr. Crane?" Harper asked, the name sending a shiver down his spine. "Dr. Alistair Crane." Blackwood nodded, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "A brilliant man years ahead of his time. He believed he could cure even the most severe cases of mental illness through unconventional methods." Harper felt his stomach lurch. What kind of methods? Blackwood's eyes took on a faraway look. Crane theorized that madness was a form of energy, a force that could be harnessed and redirected. He developed treatments that went beyond anything approved by the medical community. Electroshock therapy pushed to extremes, experimental drugs, sensory deprivation, and other techniques that defy description. As Blackwood spoke, Harper became aware of a low, pulsing hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The air in the office grew thick and oppressive, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "But something went wrong, didn't it?" Harper pressed, fighting the urge to flee from the growing sense of wrongness that permeated the room. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "Wrong? Oh no, Dr. Harper. Something went terribly right. Crane succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He found a way to tap into the very essence of madness, to distill it into its purest form. But in doing so, he opened a door that was never meant to be opened." The humming grew louder, and Harper could have sworn he saw shapes moving in the shadows of the office. formless things that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The patients in the forgotten ward, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. They aren't just mad, Dr. Harper. They've become conduits for something else, something vast and ancient and utterly alien to our reality. Harper felt his sanity beginning to fray at the edges as he struggled to process Blackwood's words. But why keep them locked away? Why not destroy them? Blackwood's eyes snapped back to Harper, suddenly sharp and focused. Destroy them? My dear boy, you don't understand what Crane discovered. It's the key to unlocking the very secrets of the human mind, of reality itself. With a growing sense of horror, Harper realized that Blackwood's eyes had begun to glow with the same eerie light he had seen in the Forgotten Ones. The older doctor rose from his chair, his movements jerky and unnatural. I've spent decades studying Crane's work, Blackwood said, his voice distorting, becoming a chorus of whispers. Preparing for this moment. And now, thanks to you, the seal has been broken. The Forgotten Ones are free, and soon, very soon, the whole world will know the truth that Crane discovered. Harper backed away, fumbling for the door handle behind him. But as he touched the cold metal, he felt it squirm and writhe beneath his fingers, as if the door itself had come alive. You can't escape, Dr. Harper, Blackwood said, advancing slowly. None of us can. We're all part of it now. Part of the great work that Crane began all those years ago. With a surge of desperate strength, Harper wrenched the door open and flung himself into the corridor beyond. But the Brookside he entered was not the one he had left. The walls pulsed with an unhealthy light, veins of some black, oily substance snaking across the peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with whispers, a cacophony of mad ramblings that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Harper ran, no longer certain if he was fleeing deeper into the asylum or desperately seeking an exit. Every turn brought new horrors. Patients melded with the very walls, their faces contorted in eternal screams, orderlies shambling along like puppets, their eyes vacant and limbs moving to some unheard rhythm. Nurses performing grotesque parodies of medical procedures on writhing, formless masses that might once have been human. As he stumbled through this nightmare landscape, Harper became aware of a presence pursuing him. He could hear Blackwood's voice echoing through the twisted corridors, sometimes seeming to come from right behind him, other times whispering directly into his mind. You can't run from this, Harper, the voice taunted. It's inside you now, inside all of us. Crane's legacy, waiting all these years to be unleashed. Harper's flight brought him to a vast circular chamber that he was certain had never been part of the original Brookside architecture. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, and the walls were lined with row upon row of glass tanks, each containing a floating, vaguely human shape. In the center of the room stood a massive machine, a nightmarish amalgamation of rusted metal, pulsing organic matter, and crackling electrical components. And there, suspended in a web of cables and tubes, was a withered, mummified figure that could only be the remains of Dr. Alistair Crane himself. As Harper stared in horror, the corpse's eyes snapped open, glowing with the same unearthly light he had seen in the Forgotten Ones. When it spoke, its voice was a symphony of madness, echoing not just in the chamber, but in the deepest recesses of Harper's mind. Welcome, Dr. Harper, Crane's corpse intoned. Welcome to the truth of our reality. The boundary between sanity and madness, between the physical and the metaphysical, it's all an illusion. And now you will help us tear down that illusion once and for all. Tendrils of shadow began to creep across the floor, reaching for Harper's feet. He tried to run, but his body refused to obey, held in place by some unseen force. As the shadows enveloped him, Harper felt his mind begin to fracture, assaulted by visions of impossible geometries and vast alien intelligences that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. In that moment of absolute terror, as he teetered on the brink of madness, Harper heard a new voice, faint but growing stronger. It was Thomas, the patient he had spoken to on his first day at Brookside. Fight it, Doctor, Thomas's voice urged. You're not one of them yet. You can still escape, but you have to act now. With a Herculean effort of will, Harper forced his body into motion. He stumbled away from the grasping shadows, his mind reeling as he tried to hold on to his sanity in the face of the horrors surrounding him. He found himself in another corridor, this one mercifully free of the pulsing organic growths that had infested much of the asylum. At the end of the hall, he could see a window, and beyond it, the faint glimmer of dawn. Harper ran towards that promise of escape, even as he heard the howls of the forgotten ones growing closer behind him. He could feel tendrils of madness trying to worm their way into his mind, whispers of forbidden knowledge and promises of power beyond imagining. But with each step, Harper focused on the image of that window, on the world beyond Brookside's walls. He thought of his life before coming to this accursed place, of the simple joys and mundane concerns that now seemed like a distant dream. As he reached the window, Harper could hear Blackwood's voice closer now, filled with a mixture of rage and pleading. "Don't be a fool, Harper. You can't escape what's inside you now. Come back and embrace the truth." But Harper was beyond listening. With a cry of desperation, he hurled himself at the window, feeling the ancient glass shatter around him as he plummeted towards the overgrown grounds below. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. For a moment he lay there, dazed and gasping, certain that at any moment he would feel the grasping hands of the forgotten ones dragging him back into the nightmare of Brookside. But as the seconds ticked by and nothing happened, Harper slowly raised his head. The asylum loomed above him, its windows dark and lifeless. There was no sign of pursuit, no unearthly howls or whispers of madness. Staggering to his feet, Harper began to stumble away from Brookside, each step taking him further from the horrors he had witnessed. But even as the asylum receded into the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed within him. The sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, but to Harper's eyes the colors seemed somehow wrong, as if the very fabric of reality had been subtly altered. And in the back of his mind, he could still hear the faint, insistent whispers of the forgotten ones, calling him back to the truth that lay hidden behind the veil of sanity. As he walked along the deserted country road, Harper knew that his ordeal was far from over. He had escaped Brookside Asylum, but the legacy of Dr. Crane's terrible experiments lived on inside him. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of ordinary perception, the forgotten ones were waiting, biding their time until the stars aligned and the door between worlds could be thrown open once more. Harper realized with a chill that settled deep in his bones that he now carried a piece of that other world within him. And he knew, with a certainty that defied rational thought, that one day, be it in a week, a year, or a decade, the call of the forgotten ward would become too strong to resist. For now he walked on, a solitary figure bathed in the light of a sun that no longer felt quite real, carrying within him the seeds of a madness that threatened to consume not just his mind, but the very fabric of reality itself. The days following Dr. Michael Harper's escape from Brookside Asylum passed in a haze of feverish delirium. He found himself in a small town some miles from the asylum, his appearance so disheveled and his manner so erratic that he was quickly admitted to the local hospital. There, under the concerned gaze of doctors who could not begin to comprehend what he had experienced, Harper drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams plagued by visions of writhing shadows and the echoing whispers of. It was a week before Harper regained enough of his faculties to provide a coherent account of what had transpired at Brookside. The local authorities, alarmed by his tale of mad doctors and patients twisted by unholy experiments, dispatched a team to investigate the asylum. But when they arrived, they found only an abandoned, derelict building, showing no signs of recent occupation. Of Dr. Blackwood, the other staff, or the tortured souls of the forgotten ward, there was no trace. Harper's story was dismissed as the ravings of a man suffering from a psychotic break, likely brought on by the stress of his new position. He was diagnosed with a variety of conditions: post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, delusional disorder, and prescribed a regimen of powerful antipsychotic medications. But the drugs did little to quiet the whispers that continued to haunt the edges of Harper's consciousness. Even as he was released from the hospital and attempted to rebuild his life, he could feel the tendrils of Brookside's madness coiling around his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness to drag him back into the abyss. Months passed, and Harper found himself adrift in a world that suddenly seemed alien and unreal. He took a position at a small private practice in another state, hoping that distance and the routine of normal life would help exorcise the horrors he had witnessed. But with each passing day, the line between reality and nightmare became increasingly blurred. Harper would find himself losing time, coming to his senses hours later with no memory of where he had been or what he had done. His patients began to complain of strange sensations during their sessions, unexplained chills, the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, whispers just on the edge of hearing. At night, Harper's dreams were a kaleidoscope of terrors. He would find himself back in the twisting corridors of Brookside, pursued by shambling horrors that wore the faces of his patients. Dr. Crane's corpse puppet would appear, its words dripping with eldritch wisdom that threatened to shatter Harper's tenuous grip on sanity. And always, there was the pulsing, rhythmic thumping that seemed to emanate from the very walls of reality itself. It was during one of these nightmares that Harper made a chilling discovery. As he fled through the nightmare version of Brookside, he glimpsed his reflection in a cracked mirror and saw not his own face, but the twisted visage of one of the forgotten ones, its eyes glowing with that terrible knowing light. Harper awoke with a scream caught in his throat, his body drenched in cold sweat. As he stumbled to the bathroom, he found himself dreading what he might see in the mirror. But his reflection, though haggard and haunted, was still recognizably his own. And yet, there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of something alien and hungry that hadn't been there before. It was then that Harper realized the true horror of what had happened to him. He hadn't escaped Brookside at all. He had merely carried a piece of it out into the world. The madness that Dr. Crane had unleashed was now a part of him, growing stronger with each passing day, threatening to consume not just his mind, but the very fabric of reality around him. Desperate for answers, Harper began to research Dr. Crane's work, scouring medical journals and obscure occult texts for any information that might help him understand what was happening to him. His office became a cluttered maze of books and papers, the walls covered in scribbled notes and diagrams that would have looked like the ravings of a lunatic to any outside observer. And perhaps, Harper thought in his more lucid moments, that's exactly what he had become. But even as he felt his sanity slipping away, he clung to the hope that if he could just unravel the mystery of Crane's experiments, he might find a way to contain the madness that threatened to spill out into the world. It was during one of his late-night research sessions that Harper made a breakthrough. Buried in the footnotes of an obscure monograph on quantum mechanics, he found a reference to a theory that aligned disturbingly well with Crane's work, the idea that human consciousness could, under certain circumstances, interact with the fundamental forces of the universe in ways that defied conventional understanding. The implications were staggering. If Crane had found a way to manipulate this interaction, to amplify it beyond normal human limits, it could explain the impossible things Harper had witnessed in the forgotten ward. But it also meant that the danger was far greater than he had imagined. The madness he carried within him wasn't just a threat to his own mind. It was a tear in the very fabric of reality, a gateway through which things from beyond could enter our world. As this realization dawned on him, Harper became aware of a change in the air around him. The ever-present whispers in the back of his mind grew louder, more insistent. The shadows in the corners of his office seemed to deepen and writhe with a life of their own. And beneath it all, he could hear the familiar thumping rhythm, growing stronger with each passing second. With a growing sense of dread, Harper realized that his research, his desperate attempts to understand what had happened to him, had only served to weaken the barriers between worlds. He had become a beacon, calling out to the forgotten ones, guiding them to this new reality. As the air grew thick with an otherworldly miasma, Harper knew he had only moments to act. He could feel the presence of the forgotten ones pressing against the thinning veil of reality, eager to spill out into this unsuspecting world. In that moment, he understood what he had to do. With trembling hands, Harper began to gather his research notes, piling them in the center of his office. As the whispers grew to a deafening crescendo, and the shadows began to coalesce into half-seen, monstrous shapes, he struck a match and set the papers ablaze. The fire spread quickly, engulfing Harper's life's work in moments. As the flames rose higher, Harper could see shapes moving within them, faces contorted in agony or ecstasy, reaching hands that seemed to beckon him closer. The heat was intense, but Harper stood his ground, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over him. As the fire consumed everything around him, Harper closed his eyes and surrendered himself to the flames. In his final moments, as the barrier between worlds grew thin enough to tear, he used the last of his strength to turn his mind inward, to seal shut the doorway that Crane's experiments had opened within him. The explosion that leveled Harper's office was attributed to a gas leak, a tragic accident that claimed the life of a promising young doctor. The authorities found no trace of his body in the rubble, nor any clue as to the true nature of his work. In the years that followed, there were whispers of strange occurrences in the town, unexplained phenomena, people going missing, moments when reality seemed to bend in impossible ways. But these incidents were isolated, contained, never growing into the full-blown invasion from beyond that Harper had feared. And in a small private cemetery on the outskirts of town, there stands a simple headstone bearing Michael Harper's name. Those who pass by it sometimes report an odd sensation, a feeling of gratitude, of a great weight lifted, as if the very air around the grave sighs with relief. For in his final act of sacrifice, Dr. Michael Harper had done what no one else could. He had closed the door that Crane had opened, sealing away the horrors of the forgotten ward once and for all. The price had been his life and his sanity, but in the end, he had found a way to protect the world from the madness that had nearly consumed him. And yet, on particularly dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees and the shadows seem to move of their own accord, some say they can still hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of a monstrous heart, beating in time with the pulse of a universe that holds far more terrors than we dare imagine. For the legacy of Brookside Asylum and the terrible experiments of Dr. Crane live on, not in our world, but in the nightmares of those who brush too close to the veil between realities. And somewhere, in the spaces between moments, in the cracks of our perception, the forgotten ones wait, patient and eternal, for the day when another curious soul dares to unlock the secrets of the mind and inadvertently opens the door to realms beyond human comprehension.